Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. As I say every week, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it. We know that 7 o'clock isn't the easiest time for a lot of people to go online and watch the show, and we're grateful that so many of you watch the show on YouTube and other platforms after the event. But we like to keep the show live. We like to make it possible for you, when you hear something or see something that's interesting or controversial, you can actually contact us quickly through the question and answer process that we have here. So again, thanks for joining us on Indie Live. This is our 148th TNT show, which means that we are vastly more popular and consistent than most of the BBC Scotland shows, which appear to last for about 30 seconds. They're evanescent, partly because they're predicated upon a peculiar way of looking at Scottish political life. Well, thanks to you, Indie Live continues to grow and add more shows, and I hope you've been enjoying these shows as they've been added. It's a tremendous tribute to Kevin Gibney, who is the powerhouse behind all of what you're seeing tonight, and so many other shows as well. So the channel needs your help. He doesn't have £300 million a year to spend like the BBC does. So this is your antidote to BBC Scotland, if you like. So it's well worth, I would suggest, you supporting it as best and as much as you can. Much appreciated. Well, it's been another great day for British democracy. Lord Frost, for it was he, stood up in the House of Lords, where he is, of course, an unelected bureaucrat, and Lord Frost made a speech. You may recall before his ennoblement that David Frost, as he was then known, was responsible for a rather crappy withdrawal agreement with the EU. The one he told us was fantastic and a great deal, but he was supported to the hilt by his boss, Boris Johnson, of blessed memory. Now Frost stands up in the House of Lords and boasts that he signed it. Listen to this. He signed it in the hope that it would collapse. So here's a man standing up in front of what is potentially a global audience, telling these people, many of them overseas, perhaps, who see this, and telling them that they can't rely upon the integrity of the British government. And he's proud of it. Now, imagine you're India or Japan or China or Timbuktu. Would you want to sign an agreement with somebody who said in advance, I possibly will not honour what I've just agreed with you? I mean, it's insane. But that's what passes for diplomacy in the UK. Some might term that an utter disgrace. Tonight, we are talking to John Randall. John is an economist and a former senior civil servant in the Scottish office. Tonight, he'll be telling us about his background and experience, but also why he supports an independent Scotland. Now, as you know, the TNT show is free and it's live, so no license, no problem. And again, thanks for joining us. We'll try and take your questions live. If you want to ask a question, the details are available. Now, to our special guest tonight. Hello, John. Thanks for joining us. How are you? You've exceeded my possibilities there. Good evening.
Good evening.
Where are you joining us from tonight, John?
From my home in Lewis. There's a storm coming. Temperature's about 14 degrees, so I think a bit cooler than where you are.
Just a little bit. John, tell us about your background and experience and how you ended up in the Scottish office and what you did there.
Right. Well, as you've probably already gathered from my accent, I am what is nowadays, I think, called a new Scot. But I was born in England 78 years ago, so I don't really feel very new, I'm afraid. But I've lived in Scotland for, I think it's about 55 years now. But I was born in Kent, very humble family background, working class background. I went to the local grammar school in the 1950s, and then on to Bristol University, where I studied geography. So I'm going to come on to economics in a minute, but I didn't actually study economics formally until late on in my career. I did quite a lot of economics actually as part of the geography course at Bristol. That's really what started me being interested in economics. But from Bristol, I went on to do a postgraduate degree at Glasgow University, starting in 1966, when I was 21. And that was, in fact, a course in town and regional planning, which was very much in vogue at that time. And the thing about the Glasgow course that attracted me was it had a lot of economics, a lot more economics and sociology than the traditional town planning courses, which tended to be more architecturally based. But in retrospect, that move to Glasgow in 1966 was the defining moment, I think, in my life. And I've never really looked back since. But a couple of things stand out to me now in retrospect from those first 21 years in England. First of all, even when I first went to Glasgow, I didn't, in fact, differentiate between England and Great Britain or the UK. That's clear to me now, reading some of my diaries that I wrote at the time, that I, without any malice, or it was due to ignorance, I think, but it reflects, I think, what was the sort of the culture in which I grew up. Most ordinary people like me at that time didn't actually know the difference really between GB, UK and England. And I don't think that was due to malevolence on their part. It was just, or indeed arrogance on their part. I think it was just the way it was, and it was due to ignorance. But that's one thing that I soon learnt to remedy, but it wasn't until after I had been in Glasgow for a little time that I began to appreciate the fundamental differences between England and the other parts of the United Kingdom. The second thing that I draw from those early years when I was at Bristol and indeed at Glasgow is that my introduction to economics was rather unconventional. I did work, as you mentioned, as a professional government economist for quite a few years, but in fact I didn't actually have an economics degree for some of that time. I was given time off when I was at the Scottish office in 1978 to go back to Glasgow University and make myself respectable by doing an MPhil in economics. So I do have an economics degree now, but I worked for quite a long time as an economist, but without an economics degree, something that I think couldn't happen these days. And the reason I'm stressing that is that I'm going to come on later to what I've been doing in retirement in Lewis and going back to economics. And I've learned a lot of economics actually since I've been in Lewis. And the fact that I had a rather unconventional entrance to economics possibly explains my willingness to embrace new economic ideas, which I find that many of the other economists, the proper economists who got degrees in the 1960s and 70s, find it difficult to do. So I'll come on to that later, but I think my background in economics was rather unconventional.
Did you, we've had a couple of questions already. One question is, we can come back to the Scottish office in a second, if that's okay with you. And the question is, what was it that persuaded you to support independence? Was there anything specific, Charles Smith is asking, that persuaded Mr. Randall to support the independence?
Well, really, I didn't well, this is jumping ahead slightly, but
Sure.
I joined the Scottish office in 1970 as an economist, although I didn't have an economics degree at that time. And I didn't tell anyone this at the time, and in fact I wouldn't have done, even if I had been allowed to, because when I became a senior civil servant, I wasn't allowed to declare any political allegiance at all, let alone join a political party. But I can tell you and your listeners that I've actually been voting for the SNP since 1974. So in every general election since then. But I have to confess that in 1974, the reason I was voting SNP was not really because I had any serious belief that independence was just around the corner. It was because by voting SNP, I thought, and correctly I think, that this would put more pressure on the Scottish office and the UK government to produce policies that were helpful to Scotland. So most of my time in the Scottish office with all my colleagues, both as an economist and then later on when I became an administrator and a senior civil servant, in all sorts of different jobs, from housing to agriculture to the environment, and ended up as the Registrar General dealing with the Census and population protections. But in all of those capacities, I and my colleagues and our ministers were fighting Scotland's corner within the UK government. And I voted SNP even in the 1970s, but to be honest, not because I seriously thought that independence was a possibility, but because having more SNP MPs, I knew at the time that our ministers and the government, UK government, would pay more attention to Scotland and would be more inclined to increase public expenditure in Scotland than was the case before. So, I have to have that, although I voted SNP incognito, if you like, for a long, long time. It was only later, in fact, really after I retired, that I began seriously that's when I joined the SNP and began seriously to promote and believe that independence was the right way forward. So maybe that was...
John, were you a civil servant when the Scottish Parliament was formed?
Well, not through most of my career, no. Scottish Parliament came into being in 1999, as you know, and my final job as Registrar General, in fact, I started that job in 1999, just before the Scottish Parliament came into existence, and I retired from that job in August 2003. So the last 4 years, it was under the Scottish Parliament, but the Registrar General, rather unusually, was not actually part of what at that time was called the Scottish Executive, is now called the Scottish Government, because it was seen as the Registrar General has his own statutory responsibilities under separate legislation. So, in fact, the Registrar General is not, for some of his or her duties, is not under the instruction of government ministers, which I should say was a great end to my career. But I wasn't technically part of the Scottish Executive, although it was during the time of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, it might seem a terribly obvious question, but I'll ask it anyway. The Scottish office you describe seems to be light years away from the Scottish office we have now, which does not, in the minds of many people, seek to bolster and support and convince the UK government to spend more money in Scotland and to support Scottish needs and aspirations. It seems to work on entirely the opposite context, which is to say we're here to resist pretty much anything that the Scottish Parliament agrees. I mean, you can see all the examples around you: the drugs policy, the bottle return scheme, Is that because there is now a Scottish Parliament and therefore the Scottish office sees its role very differently? Are you able to speculate on that?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right, John. The Scottish office, all the time I was there for over 30 years, under Conservative governments as well as Labour governments, I am quite sure that all our ministers did their very best, as they saw it, to help Scotland, to help Scotland's economy even. They did fight Scotland's corner. And the Secretaries of State for Scotland in those days absolutely were Scotland's champions in the UK government. That is not the case now. After, I think the real dividing line, this was after I retired, was when in 2007, when Alex Salmond became First Minister with a minority SNP government. And I still remember watching the television in Lewis when he was shortly after he became First Minister, and he started attacking verbally Alistair Darling, who was the Minister for Business and Industry and Business, I think, at the time. Now, I'm quite certain that probably all of the Secretaries of State that I worked for in the Scottish office would have loved to weigh in to their Westminster colleagues in a similar way. But because we were all part of the UK government and you didn't do that. The convention was that you supported government policy, even if you disagreed with it. And even Conservative ministers, in my experience, did fight their corner. I mean, George Younger, the Secretary of State, he and I was involved in saving Ravenscraig, for the penultimate, we saved it for the last time, but of course it closed a bit later on.
The thing is, John, it would be hard to conceive of that happening now.
Yes, absolutely. And it is to do, it is the fact that we have a Scottish Parliament, but I think even more important is that we have a Scottish Parliament that is led now by the SNP. Because in the first few years of devolution, Labour were in control with the Lib Dems in Scotland and a Labour government at Westminster. So that party allegiance did moderate any difference between the two governments.
Sticking to the Scottish office for a minute. So if you had to describe the role of the Scottish office now, how would you describe it? What's its purpose?
I don't have any first-hand experience of the Scottish government, of the Secretary of State now. The Scottish government today is absolutely doing its bit for Scotland, and it's controlled by ministers. But the Secretary of State for Scotland is part of a different government. Yeah, the Secretary of State for Scotland.
What is the Secretary of State's role, do you think?
Well, it's a bit like the Governor General of the colonies, I think, in the old days, and that's totally different from. I'm sure that he would deny that, but he very much comes across as the voice of the UK government in Scotland, keeping us in control, rather than fighting Scotland's corner in the UK cabinet, which is what our ministers used to do successfully. I should.
Don't you think that change was inevitable come the emergence of a Scottish Parliament? I mean, what else could this Secretary of State do?
Yes, I don't think the UK government has a lot of powers reserved to it that affect Scotland. So there is theoretically a role for the Secretary of State in relation to quite a lot of economic policy, foreign affairs, defence. So in theory, there are things he could be doing on Scotland's behalf. A lot less than used to be the case, because most of the Scottish offices' powers are now devolved to the Scottish government. Yeah. But you could still argue that there is a case for having a Secretary of State for Scotland. But the current Secretary of State for Scotland and his recent predecessors. This is my view, just by observing things. I wasn't involved personally. Seems to be representing the UK government and often criticising and indeed undermining the Scottish government.
Well, if you take into account what you've just said, coupled with the fact that it is the case that the Secretary of State for Scotland has refused to come and appear before various Scottish parliamentary committees, which would seem to me to be a basic courtesy. If you take those two things together, you do rather end up with a rather colonialist flavour to the whole relationship, where his role is to say, I'm not here to cooperate or collaborate with anyone. I'm here to tell you what to do. That does sound rather imperial.
If you go, my assessment, if you like, is that going back, certainly during the time of the Scottish Office, and in the early days of the Scottish Parliament, even strong unionists had a respect for Scotland, and many conservative unionist politicians, people like John Buchan, for example, George Younger, they were in favour of the UK, but they also believed that Scotland, was different, and they wanted Scotland to be different, but within the overall umbrella of the UK. Now, what's changed in recent years is this, what's sometimes described as muscular unionism, and that's certainly the case, in my view, of Alistair Jack and indeed some of his predecessors, and Boris Johnson certainly, who are trying actually to row back on the devolution settlement, and they're interfering in devolved matters and deliberately doing it. And Brexit has played a role in that, because some of the responsibilities that the Scottish executive and Scottish government used to carry out. But
again, wasn't that also inevitable? Because power devolved as power retained. I mean, that's the whole point. The reason that it worked for Buchan and the others is because it is devolved. There was nothing that they thought was helpful about the British Empire being deconstructed. What they seemed to have affection for was a relationship that was almost like a father and child, i.e. that the child was Scotland and the father was Westminster, and the father could be indulgent or otherwise, depending on the mood music or whatever at the time. But nothing had to change fundamentally. That connection had to remain the same.
Well, I think the difference is that, I don't think it was inevitable. I think there are different brands of unionism, and you do have a historic paternalistic brand of unionism that's not anti-Scottish. Actually, it wants Scotland to play a full part in the union, but it certainly doesn't want it to leave the union. So a lot of people are like that, but that is very different from the active opposition to Scotland, which is what's happening now.
I mean, I've tried to chart that change in my Sunday National columns with Elliot Bloomer, and it seemed to occur around about 15, 20 years ago, when the Conservatives moved from being almost a slightly federalist view of the UK without the actual instruments, but a sense of we're all part of this together, and it's hugely important that London should recognise the separate nature of politics in Scotland. We seem to have moved away from that completely.
Well, it happened in 2007, and that's because since then Scotland has had a government that actually wants to break up the UK. So that's the difference, and you don't have to oppose that in sort of hostile way that the current UK government is doing. But I think that was the breaking point, and they would say that it's because of the Scottish government, and the SNP taking their view, in my view, on independence.
couldn't you likewise argue, if you open a history book, to say the same thing happened in India, the same thing happened in Singapore, the same thing, Malaysia. You could go on and on. Wherever devolved administration was set up, fairly inevitably you ended up with that administration saying to the imperial government, as it was then, look, we need more powers or all powers. You need to make up your mind which of these it's going to be.
Well, it certainly happened in Ireland, where there was violence that led to the breakup of Ireland leaving the UK. And the traditional paternalistic unionists that I'm mentioning, and that I served under, some of them, and I'm sure they were genuine in their views. They would, they would reject any idea that they were controlling Scotland because it was part of the British Empire or anything like that. They genuinely believed that that was the case. So if that type of paternalistic traditional unionist view still prevailed, then I think there could be a modus vivendi between the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament. I don't think it's inevitable. It's got to lead to hostility and so on. But that's the way it's gone.
Yeah, we have a question here, and the question is asking: does John believe the Labour Party could introduce federalism throughout the UK without holding a referendum, while denying Scotland a referendum on independence?
Well, I mean, nothing to stop it doing that constitutionally, but the problem with federalism is that England is not very keen on it, and Scotland's not very keen on it. At least the SNP is not very keen on it. But the real problem is in England, where there have been attempts to set up regional governments under Labour. In fact, John Prescott was the sort of champion of that, and in northeast England, which I think was seen as the most likely to be in favour, they rejected the idea, and I don't think that's changed these days. So the problem is not that it's not impossible for them to introduce it, but I don't think it would have the necessary support in England.
Yeah, that's more likely the case, because I think it has to be articulated over a period of time, and there has to be some sort of cultural, very strong and profound cultural imperative behind it, perhaps. So that brings us on to...
The basic problem is that England has 85% of the population of the UK. So having a federal structure, you couldn't really do it if England was to be one part of the federal structure. You'd have to break England up into smaller regions, and that's where the problem is, that the regions of England don't seem to be keen on the idea.
Well, they're perhaps not keen on the version that they see, which is that limited responsibility and limited powers, and I can't say I altogether blame them for that, because it's hard to see a government that treats Scotland the way it presently does being any more generous or caring towards parts of England that might become federal. It's just difficult to see that. But I wanted to bring us on to, you were a supporter of independence from way back. And if you were to look ahead, let's say 5 years from now, what sort of Scotland and what sort of Britain do you envisage?
Well, there's two different questions here. I mean, what I think is likely to happen, it's anyone's guess. I don't really know, but I do still believe, absolutely do believe, that independence is the best course for Scotland. And since retirement and since living in Lewis, I've joined the SNP, and I have become more active in politics than I was able to do when I was a civil servant. And so I joined the Scottish Currency Group, for example, and I joined the SNP. And I did write this article, which is in Bylines Scotland, setting out why I believe in independence. And maybe I could just say a few words about that. But it perhaps seems odd to some people that as an economist or an ex-economist, I don't actually think that the main reason in favour of Scottish independence is to do with economics. I think it's to do with the much more basic problem that under the present system, the democratic deficit is the problem. In Scotland does have different priorities, values than England. That's demonstrated all sorts of indicators of surveys, willingness to raise taxes, for example, donations to charities, welcoming or not immigrants. A whole range of indicators suggest that Scotland's values are different from those in England. Of course, there are variations within Scotland and variations within England, but in aggregate, there's a clear difference. And that is expressed also in the political voting patterns, that Scotland has actually not voted for the Conservative Party as a majority since the 1950s or 1964. I think actually there were more votes for the Conservatives than there were for Labour. But since the early 60s, Scotland has consistently rejected the Conservatives, and they have always voted, we have always voted, for either the Labour Party or, more recently, for the SNP. But those values, as expressed in the parties that we are voting for, cannot possibly carry the day, in the sense that our politicians are outnumbered heavily by the voters of England. So that is why we have ended up with the great majority of the time, during my lifetime, and certainly since I became a civil servant, that Scotland has had a government, UK government, that it didn't vote for. So that is the fundamental argument for independence, in my view. Yeah. Only with independence can Scotland guarantee that it will elect a government that reflects its own different political priorities. Now,
you also suggested in your article that Scottish citizens put more value into an inclusiveness and community solidarity.
Yeah,
why do you say that?
Well, it's quite clear to me that from attitudinal surveys and my personal experience, as someone that lived in England for a time, that community values and thinking of other people is far more common value in Scotland than it is in England, where individuality and, is many people, that's their main motive, to look after themselves. And I'm not saying that's not true about a lot of people in Scotland. I think we all have some inclination to look after ourselves, but the community value is very much stronger in Scotland, and it's, I should say, particularly strong in the Western Isles, even stronger than it is in other parts of Scotland. So when David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, talked of the big society, I think Scotland and certainly the Western Isles could legitimately say, what are you talking about? We already have a big society. And that is reflected in what's happening today. Community land ownership, for example, and let's say welcoming immigrants. I mean, not everyone in Scotland or the Western Isles welcomes immigrants, but a far higher proportion of them do than is the case in England as a whole. Again, there are differences within England, but the majority, as revealed in Brexit.
It's so ironic, because if that hostility to immigrants had been quite as forceful several hundred years ago, we wouldn't have the royal family we have just now.
No, absolutely not. No, and I mean the other factor, of course, is that again there's a difference
from Holland and from Germany and goodness knows where else.
But another difference between Scotland and England is that we actually need immigrants to increase our labour force and population, whereas in many parts of England, the main concern is keeping people out. Our economy our industries, tourism and agriculture, fishing, they all need more labour. And this is where Brexit has been so disastrous for Scotland, that the flow of immigration has been reduced. And in England, that people are maybe very pleased about that, but it's a disaster.
In that case, sorry to interrupt, John. In that case, I want to come on to the Scottish currency group in a second, but just dealing with Brexit, because you raised it. The great majority of people across the whole island now are opposed to Brexit. And yet the political class, that's Tory and Labour, remain committed to it. In fact, Labour have this extraordinary statement that they wish to make Brexit work. Do you think that's an oxymoron?
Oh, yeah, I mean, you can make anything work. It's how well it works. And I don't think there's any way that the advantages, so there were many advantages of being in the EU, not just economic advantages, but there were economic advantages too. I don't think that can be easily replicated outside the EU. And you say all the political classes are in favour of Brexit. Well, I mean, that's not true in Scotland. The SNP, Scottish Government, absolutely wants to rejoin Europe, and quite rightly so.
Yeah. But here we have a situation where the politicians tell us that as true Democrats, they wish to reflect public opinion. But on this hugely important matter, the Labour and Tory parties have said, well, to heck with you. We have no plans to reflect that opinion. What do you make of that?
Well, there's many other examples of where politicians have gone against public opinion. So it's not unique in that matter. I mean, capital punishment, for example, for many years, there was probably a majority of people in Britain in favour of capital punishment, but the politicians of all parties really didn't allow that. So it's not unheard of that politicians take a different view from the voters. That's certainly the case with Brexit. And what's remarkable to me is that the Labour Party, UK Labour Party, appears to be following the UK Conservative government line on just about everything, including Brexit. So the idea that a UK Labour government, which is more likely now at the next general election, the idea that can really turn things round, and looks increasingly unlikely to me. So the differences between the Labour government and the Conservative Party seem to be vanishingly small to me at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I speak to Labour people who say this to me, and I'd like your view on this, please. They say to me, well, John, you have to be, it's called realpolitik, and you have to understand that it would be very, very difficult for the Labour Party to be elected on a radical programme. So what we're going to do is pretend that we're not progressive, and then once we get in, we plan to be radical and progressive. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, that's certainly a strategy that many politicians have used. I'm not denying that that's not a possibility. But, and this does actually bring me on to the Scottish Currency Group and the fundamental issue that we are raising in the Scottish Currency Group. And that is that we need a new economics paradigm. For the last many, many years, and certainly since the 1970s, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, all political parties in the UK have been part of, embedded in a certain way of looking at economics. I was trained in that way. What is now called neoliberal or classical economics puts a lot of weight on the advantages of the market system to solve problems. And there are some theoretical advantages. If the assumptions underlying the theory about perfect competition and lack of monopoly power and so on, perfect information. If all of that applies, then the theory, is very, looks really nice. And however, the problem is that those assumptions are very often, in fact, never actually correct. So the neoliberal paradigm is supported these days by Conservatives and Labour. And in fact, unfortunately, I would really like to make this point, also is supported by the leadership of the SNP and the Scottish government. And this is one of the most frustrating things I find, because just to give a few examples of what this new paradigm, basically the new paradigm would recognize the fundamental difference between a government that has its own currency and is therefore a currency issuer, which an independent Scotland would have that power, as opposed to the current devolved Scottish government, which doesn't have its own currency and is a currency user. And what the Scottish government can do with its current powers are so vastly different from what is possible with its own currency, which can only happen with independence. And that is not sufficiently recognized by not only politicians, but I think the great majority of classically trained economists. So we have a fundamental problem here that the political classes, all parties, unfortunately, including the leadership of the SNP, and most economists and the media and public opinion, they all subscribe, unconsciously perhaps, to this neoliberal paradigm, which is fundamentally based on the false analogy with the household. At an individual household, if your income declines, you have to rein in your expenditure, just as the Scottish government has to do as a currency user. But that is not the case in an independent government with its own currency, because an independent government with its own currency can create more of the currency.
Yeah,
and it's
we'll probably talk about this more in the future, but I just wanted to explore one thing with you, John, which is that the SNP, I think, is still committed to this notion that there would be some time gap between independence and issuing one's own currency, one's own central bank. What's your opinion on that?
Well, that's right. The Scottish government, give them credit, has moved towards the position advocated by the Scottish Currency Group and some others. And the official position of the Scottish government now, as in the October White Paper last year, is that Scotland would introduce its own separate currency as soon as practicable after independence. And that's something we can go along with. But the problem is that the Scottish government and the economists and others who are advising it, and all the other parties, they interpret as soon as practicable as meaning after a series of tests are met. And in practice, these tests would probably take years, certainly several months. And we in the Scottish Currency Group believe that that is actually not a sustainable position. Even if Scotland was to retain sterling for a short time after independence, we would be wide open to the threat that the UK government and or the Bank of England could withdraw support for Scotland using the pound through its interbank payment system. Now, that would be a disaster for Scotland. And moreover, it would be a disaster in any independence campaign, because just as in 2014, when George Osborne torpedoed the Scottish government's proposals for a currency union, because it takes two to tango, it would be so easy for the UK government, and the Secretary of State for Scotland would be in the van of this, I'm sure, saying, well, during the independence campaign, if you keep sterling, we're going to take you out of the interbank payment system. That would lose the campaign. I've no doubt at all. It's an unsustainable position, and it is wrong in my opinion, and the Scottish government's, the SCG's opinion, for that not to be recognised. And it's extremely frustrating that the opportunities of independence with our own currency, and only with our own currency, are not actually being recognised by the very people who could use this to win independence.
So your take is that, let me get this right. I mean, I accept everything you say, and I do recall Margaret Thatcher comparing the UK economy to a household, and she said we can't spend any more than we earn. I remember that. But having said that, that's exactly the position that the Labour Party is adopting right now. They are saying we could be progressive, we could make commitments. However, we don't know how much money we have, and so therefore we can't make any commitments. What is your take on that?
Well, during my retirement, I said I've read up a lot of new economics. I have been influenced by what I regard as insights from what is now known as modern monetary theory. Now, not everyone agrees that this is such a novel idea, and maybe you could argue that what goes around comes around, and so on. But MMT, modern monetary theory, does make this basic distinction between a currency issuer and a currency user. And this is really important when it comes to things like the so-called national debt. Now, the reason the Labour Party and the Conservative Party say, oh, we can't possibly increase more public expenditure, is because of the so-called national debt. And this is what underlies the austerity approach which the Conservatives introduced under David Cameron and George Osborne, and which they now see under Rishi Sunak and under Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, determined to go back to. Now, that this obsession with the national debt that is where modern monetary theory and the new paradigm that I'm advocating would make a big difference, because it's a lot of this so-called national debt is simply the savings of people in the country, and it's not a debt in the sense that it's owed to foreign countries, and it's actually the government's debt. But a lot of that debt is the savings of people in Britain, and in fact, at the moment, a lot of it is it's actually the government owes money to the Bank of England, to its own bank. Now, if you owe something to yourself, that's not really a debt as commonly believed. It's not something that has to be paid back. It's not something that has there's a cost attached to them. So we need to get away from this obsession with reducing the national debt. And we also need to get away from the obsession that a public sector deficit is somehow terrible. And we have all the annual JERS fiasco when the government, including the Scottish government, produces these figures showing that Scotland apparently has a larger public sector deficit as a percentage of GDP than England does anyway, or the rest of the UK. And that again is something that is being blown out of all proportion, because a government with its own currency can create new currency. It's never going to run out of money. This idea that which I think it was Liam Byrne left a note to the incoming Conservative government saying, oh, there's no money left. I mean, that is just absolute madness. Money is actually not the constraint to a government that has its own currency. Now, there are other constraints. I'm not trying to say that you can just keep spending and create more currency all the time. The real constraint is on the real resources of the economy, the labor force, the skills of the labor force, the infrastructure in place. That if new money is created and government spends on things unsustainably, without any limit, then you will reach a position where, because of the shortage, because of real resource constraints, inflation becomes a problem. So one has to manage things carefully. But the idea that we're going to run out of money is just absurd. No longer with our own currency is the issue of money that can be created by the government. The problem is the labor force and other resources properly organized with the right skills to deliver what is needed. And there are a whole load of things that are needed at the moment, and increasingly so looking forward, not just in Britain. Climate change, for example, the health service, addressing inequality. All of those are major challenges for all governments, and certainly in the UK and in Scotland. And all of those, contrary to what the neoliberal economists might say, cannot be solved through private markets. It needs the public sector, the government, to take the lead in addressing climate change, inequalities, and the health service. But we could do these things with our own currency in independent Scotland. Now, we can't do everything at once. We've got to be careful to do with the real resources. But that is the way forward, and that is what most people in Scotland actually want. So the idea that the Scottish government and the SNP are not advancing this view, which would win the independence campaign because of an attachment to neoliberal values, is absurd and extremely frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it must be confusing for people, don't you think, when they hear Keir Starmer and every single member of the shadow cabinet saying exactly the opposite to what you've just said. They say neoclassical economics is what we're bound to. There is no money. We cannot spend money we don't have. I mean, you must have heard them over and over and over again over the last 2 or 3 months saying exactly that.
Yeah, it's in my opinion, economic madness. But most people in this country, ordinary people, brought up on the household analogy, believe them. So when Rachel Reeves says, "Oh, I used to work for the Bank of England, and I'm going to be prudent and not live beyond our resources," I mean that resonates with ordinary people because it has a sort of obvious link to their own situation. But it's not actually right, because as individual households, you do have to live within your means. But a UK government, it certainly can create money through the Bank of England. So there are constraints. I'm not trying to say there aren't any constraints, but money is not one of them.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating. We've had some very positive comments, by the way, on your remarks, John. I'll pass on, but you say this, and I'd like you to substantiate it. You say most reputable economists accept that independent Scotland is now well placed, and go on to say Scotland is a wealthy country.
Well, if you look at league tables for GDP per head is not the only measure, and I'm not advocating that, but it's probably the most common one for the wealth of the country. And Scotland is in the top 25 countries for GDP per head, so it is already relatively wealthy. But its opportunities are even greater than is currently the case. Scotland is linked economically as well as politically, to a large extent, unfortunately, to the rest of the UK. And the UK economy has been growing and is projected to grow extremely slowly. So, I mean, the idea that Scotland has to sort of continue its links with the rest of the UK, again, is economic madness, when smaller economies, Denmark, Norway, Ireland, many of the best performing economies, not just in output terms, but in terms of well-being and environmental policies, they tend to be countries of about Scotland's size, 5 million or so. New Zealand is another. So they are the economies actually that are doing best on all sorts of indicators. And there's absolutely no reason, in fact, quite the contrary, why Scotland, with its vast energy resources, renewable energy resources, could not just emulate them, but I mean, we would be in a very strong position, a very, very strong position. So, and most economists, I think, would agree with that. Now, very few people, even in 2014, were saying that Scotland couldn't make it, if you like, go it alone. The argument was that although they all admitted that Scotland could go it alone, they argued that it would be better to stay with the UK, sort of the broad shoulders and all that.
You also say that the younger generations in Scotland identify more with much less with Britain and its traditional institutions, and that the older age groups fear their personal interests might be threatened by independence. In the light of these two remarks, what is your feeling today about government, fully backed by the Labour Party, have announced that they plan to look again at the triple lock on pensions?
Well, I mean, that's as far as the independence movement is concerned, that's great, because if you stay with the UK, you know what's going to happen. Labour and Conservatives are not necessarily going to keep the triple lock. An independent Scottish government would, I mean, I can't speak for the post-independent Scottish government, but with its own currency, absolutely no reason why the Scottish pension could not be increased significantly to more like the European average. So actually, if you're just interested in old age pensions, vote independent. That's the way to increase the pension. And the rhetoric that's coming from the Labour and Conservative parties is, supports that view.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So we're about to go into an election with both the major parties, the election next year, with both the major parties saying things like, we can't afford pensions, we can't afford the NHS, we can't afford doctors and nurses, we can't afford, I mean, the list is almost endless about what cannot be afforded. And having said all of this, at the end of this litany, they say, vote for us. And in the case of the Labour Party, they are saying, vote for change. Having previously said there's no prospect of change because there's no money. I mean, it just seems to be an asinine position to take. There is another misconception, and I'd like your view on this. At the 2014 referendum, John, you may recall that a number of pensioners were told that there was a specific pension pot from which their pension was paid. And that pot, there might be no access to that pot after independence.
No, that is not the case.
Pensions are paid out of the current account, aren't they?
Yes, and the Scottish government, I mean, the present Scottish government, no one can tie the hands of a future Scottish government, but the present Scottish government is on record as saying that the Scottish, under independence, the Scottish government would take over responsibility for pensions in Scotland. So it's not coming out of a pot. But the difference is that with our own currency, the Scottish government could raise the level of the Scottish pension beyond that, well above that of what it is in England.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you make, John. Okay, that's splendid. This has been fantastic. I did say the hour would go quickly past. We've run out of time.
Okay.
I'd just like to say thank you very much, John. I hope you can stick around for a few seconds afterwards.
Sure.
And as we wrap up. Thank you, John, and thank you to all of you watching and listening tonight. Do tell all your friends. We have great guests here. John is not unique in that sense. He has brought some very interesting and important comments about pensions and about the economics of an independent Scotland and why he supports independence. And a big thank you to you, John. And a big thank you to all of you for watching. Please look out for my column in the Sunday National this weekend. I'll be dealing in part with a survey commissioned by a fairly stout unionist group, but it says some very interesting things about why Britain is broken. In fact, that's the name of the survey. So I might be dealing with a little bit of that on Sunday. Look out for that, please. We're back next week with another amazing guest. You know our track record. You only have to look at it, see how interesting and educational our guests are. Join us, please, on September 20. In the meantime, stay safe and take care. Good night, all.